Professor Edward Kamens is Sumitomo Professor of Japanese Studies at Yale University, where he has taught since 1986. He has published books and articles on Buddhism and Japanese literature, classical poetry, and literary interactions with the visual arts. And he is currently directing a digital humanities research project focused on a 17th century calligraphy album, which is in the Beinecke Library. From 1998 to 2008, he was the associate head of Saybrook College, and he served as the head of college in 2009 and 2011. Professor Kamens has been chair of the East Asian Languages and Literatures Department for several terms, and he has also served a term as acting director of the Whitney Humanities Center. He was the founding chair of Yale's Committee on Language Studies and helped launch Yale's highly successful Richard U. Light Fellowship for the study of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean in East Asia. His teaching covers Japanese literature from the earliest periods to the 19th century, and one of his most recent publications is called Waka and Things, Waka as Things, which was published in 2017. Professor Ed Kamens currently resides in Los Angeles with his wife, Sterling Professor Emeritus and former Dean of Yale College, Mary Miller. And for those of you who may have traveled with Professor Kamens and Mary, we were sad to lose her to the Getty Museum in LA. Professor Kamens will retire from Yale in December of 2022, but he will be hosting our travel program to Japan in 2023. And so we're going to talk today about that program, learn a little bit about the itinerary, learn a bit about Japan in the process, and hopefully those of you who are interested in signing up for the program will get some information that you need to know to help you decide. And those of you who just want to do some armchair travel or travel independently will learn a lot as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Kamens. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, and I will share my screen, if I may. Okay. Thank you everybody for joining this afternoon. It was exciting for me just now to see your chat postings and welcome so many friends from many different moments in my life, and people who have traveled with Mary, people who have studied at Yale, taught at Yale with me and Mary over the many years. There's clearly something of a nostalgic theme in today's presentation, remembrances of Japan's past, encounters with Japan's present. It's clear from your chat postings that many of you have traveled to Japan, have a professional or artistic or other kind of personal interest in Japan incorporated into your life in one way or another. This is a kind of hybrid talk in which what I put together are some comments and images that trace the itinerary which we have worked out, I have worked out working together with Yale academic, the Yale Alumni Academy and its travel program. One of the great privileges of working with Lauren and her team is that they invite input from the faculty member that is going to lead the trip. And so what emerges is often indeed a kind of hybrid of recommendations that come from our travel companies that we work with, but tailored to the interests and preferences and if you like, even fetishes of someone like me, who's experienced Japan since 1969, when I first went there as a high school exchange student, and most recently in the fall of 2019, the most recent time I was there. I haven't, all of us, or pretty much all of us, have been unable to go there during the pandemic period, but things are looking pretty promising for us to go on a trip which will take us into encounters with Japan's past and with its present. My contribution to the shaping of this itinerary reflects some of the materials in the study of Japanese literature, especially Japanese poetry, that have been at the heart of my teaching and research over the entire period that I've been studying and teaching about Japan. So those are my remembrances. But as you'll see, the remembrance of the past is also a theme in that literature. And that's what I wanted to elucidate in this talk and put it in the larger framework of how we encounter that past, which some of us will be remembering from our own experiences of reading Japanese literature, and others will have it become part of an experience that they can remember, either if their only encounter with it is this armchair tour today, or if indeed you're able to come on this itinerary with us next spring. Trying to get my program to move here. Sorry. There we go. So I think everybody is familiar with the way that Japan looks on a map, on a globe, and in Mercator projections of this kind, Japan looks like a very strictly north to south archipelago. Its total landmass is roughly the same as the state of California, where I now live. But in fact, the Japanese archipelago runs more northwest to south, northeast to southwest. And the division, say, between Tokyo and Kyoto, and this part of Japan, which we'll be spending most of our time in this talk and on this trip next spring, is thought of as a division rather between east and west. Kyoto, the ancient city, the ancient capital city, is thought of as, is indeed part of the west, Kansai in Japanese, and Tokyo is the metropolis at the heart of the east, Kanto. In addition, the name Kyoto, old capital, the capital city, literally translated, is the basis for the name that was given to the city of Edo, as it had been called up until the middle of the 19th century, when, as Japan's new modern capital, it was renamed Tokyo, the Eastern capital. As I said, this itinerary and this talk focuses on Western Japan, with Kyoto at the heart of what's really thought of as the Japanese cultural and historical heartland. And some of the places that we'll be talking about and visiting in today's talk and on that itinerary include Kyoto, which is up here in the corner, off this map. We'll be taking a ferry, and we'll do that in this talk virtually, over to the far less visited island of Shikoku to visit a number of sites. From there, we'll be going to Kurashiki, and I'll explain in a bit why that's an important place on our itinerary. And then finally, from there, east to Tokyo. For the most part, we'll be focused in this talk and at the beginning of this itinerary in Kyoto, the old capital, now a modern city, but a modern city through which one doesn't have to look too far beneath the surface, if at all, to see and experience and have a sense of Japan's past. And in particularly, we will be visiting Arashiyama in the northwest part of the city. We will be spending time today talking about the Kitano Tenmangu Shrine here in the north central part of the city. We'll be making an excursion to the northeast suburbs, to a place called Ohara, also known as Ono, and to another shrine down here to the southwest, the Minase Shrine. I'll be explaining why we're going to those places. My very first experience in Japan as a high school exchange student in 1969, I happened to be assigned to live with a host family who lived in the most beautiful part of the city of Kyoto, I still think so, called Arashiyama. It's famous for this gorgeous bridge that crosses a river which changes its name both above and below the bridge. This is the mountain known as Arashiyama Storm Mountain, although as you can see in this photo, it is often not particularly stormy there. And it's also famous on the east side of the river for these extraordinarily beautiful forests of bamboo, which we'll be strolling through. Many of you perhaps have already been there. Less visited, I think, by American and European tourists is the Kitano Shrine, the Kitano Tenmangu Shrine, which has a very interesting backstory about the origins myths of the deity who is worshipped there. We'll talk about him. And likewise to another shrine in the southeast, which is associated with some other historical figures, two poets in particular. We'll talk about them. I think this is a place almost never on American tourist itineraries. If for that reason alone, a good place for us to go. As I mentioned, we'll be going to the northeast, to Ohara. The story that I'm going to tell about visiting Ohara, otherwise known as Ono, is related to the story of the Minase Shrine, but it also has other important literary associations, which we'll touch on briefly. But eventually we'll be, as I said, crossing the straits from Osaka to Shikoku, when the deity, formerly a human being, who eventually became the deity worshipped at the Tenmangu Shrine, went into exile and left the capital city to head far to the southwest to the island of Kyushu, where he died. He traveled, according to the illustrated hand scroll that tells the story of the origins of the shrine, in a boat that is imagined, at least, as looking like something like this, but we'll make our crossing in a modern ferry that looks something more like this. In the latter stages of our visit to the island of Shikoku, we'll be going to the now quite famous and quite often visited by American and European tourists, a place called Naoshima, known familiarly as the Art Island. Now, this is a place where, since taking up residence in Los Angeles and encountering cognoscenti in the world of contemporary art, I can't speak to someone who tells me that they haven't been there, but I have never been there, and I'm very excited about going. But then when we leave the Art Island and its contemporary art wonders, once again, we'll be going back in time to the wonderfully preserved canal-lined streets with these characteristic black and white tiled and plaster-covered buildings along the canal side, the town of Kurashiki, where I spent a year when I took a year off as an undergraduate from Yale from 1972 to 1973. Among its many attractions are this extraordinary museum, formerly a private museum, the Ohara Museum, with its very special collections of Western art. So it's quite a variety of kinds of places that we will be visiting today, as well as on the actual itinerary. It ends in Tokyo, and we would be extraordinarily lucky in April and May of next year if we had a day as clear as this, where in fact, on a very truly clear day, whether you're up in the radio tower, a relatively new radio tower built in part of the city, from various parts of city high points, you can see Fujisan, Mount Fuji, always snow-covered in the distance. It will be something of a culture shock, I think, to go from the preserved ambiance of 17th century Kurashiki to nothing could be more modern and contemporary than Tokyo. And that's kind of the point. So a number of truly interesting places to visit, but also in this talk at least, and as I've suggested, shaping that itinerary and the content of this talk are a number of interesting dramatis personae, one of whom is the late 9th, early 10th century poet and scholar Sugawara no Michizane. Just a word about Japanese names, if you don't know this already. Japanese names are configured with the family or surname first and a personal name secondarily. So Sugawara was this gentleman's family name. The particle no is used when we talk about distinguished persons of imperial lineage in the past. And he was indeed descended from the son of a much earlier emperor. He rose to prominence through the favoritism of the emperor ruling during his time, but his family was a hereditary family of scholars. And so this emperor offended the other families who had a hereditary claim on political and administrative posts of the kind that the emperor promoted Michizane to. And out of jealousy, they contrived to accuse him of treason and disloyalty to the throne, and the emperor was forced to send him into exile. He died in exile, leaving behind a huge legacy of poetry and prose written in both what we today called literary Sinitic, that is writings in Chinese, the literary language of scholars of his day, and also poems in Japanese, the vernacular. Because a number of tragic and horrific events, earthquakes, fires in the capital, emperor falling to illness, these were attributed to his angry spirit for having been falsely accused of disloyalty, and because he had died without those false accusations being cleared from his name, he died with rancor. So he was thought to be an angry spirit causing these disasters. What do you do in a situation like that? You declare him to be a deity, a god, a kami, renamed Tenjin, the heavenly or celestial one, to placate that spirit. And ever since, he has been worshipped as a deity of scholarship, poetry, calligraphy. the image on the far right is a painting by the early 17th century noted calligrapher and painter Konoe Nobutada, who undertook during one period of his life to make an image of Tenjin, the deity, every day, one a day. This one happens to be in the collection of the Yale University Art Gallery. That's one of our personae. Others include, and I'll talk more about them later, another poet of the 9th century, Ariwara no Narihira, and a somewhat later emperor and poet, Gotoba. And when we move to discussion of our modern era, we have the founder of the Kurashiki Ohara Museum, a gentleman, a businessman, extremely successful businessman in the textile industry of his day, Ohara Magosaburo. And at the Art Island, the most distinguished architectural landmarks there are the work of the internationally renowned architect Ando Tadao, who has, among other things, been a frequent guest at the Yale School of Architecture. So Michizane's story, as I said, is about his rise to prominence in the court aristocracy, his literary accomplishments, and his tragic fall. An illustrated hand scroll, one of a very few of these extraordinary kinds of painted hand scrolls with text that survive from the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. One of the most famous of them is called the Kitano Tenjin Engi Emaki, the hand scroll about the origin legends of the Kitano Tenjin Shrine. It is held at the shrine. And if we are fortunate, when we visit the shrine, we'll be able to see it on display. As I said, he was distinguished as a poet, both writing in Chinese, what we today call literary Sinitic. Here's a poem of his from the year 902, shortly before his exile and death. He has come to be closely associated with plum trees, flowering plum trees, and their blossoms, because he wrote a number of poems about plum blossoms. In his time, those plum blossoms themselves, like the poetic form in which he was writing, were thought of, among other things, as an import from the Chinese East Asian continent. So to write about them in and of itself was an act of crossing the East China Sea in one's imagination and taking on the role of a Chinese scholar. So in the first line of his poem, the ones newly planted north of Sempu Ward, that's actually a place in an imagined Chinese capital. The ones planted at banquet time west of Jiju Palace, that was a place in the city of Kyoto, the capital as he knew it in Japan. They're different plums, though the same man sang to them. He had sung the praises of those plums, both in the Chinese plum trees of his imaginations and the ones he could see and experience in the Japanese capital. Now, those flowers must have laughed at all my grieving, as I'm now in trouble with the authorities and facing the condemnation of exile. And here's a Japanese poem of his, also on the subject of the plum blossoms, together with a topic introducing prose line, looking at plum blossoms in his garden after having been sentenced to exile. If an east wind blows, send me your fragrance by it, blossoms of plum. Do not forget the springtime because your master is gone. In the painting, in the hand scroll, he's gazing at the plum trees planted in his own garden in his own home in the capital city. Now, after having been sentenced to exile, he anticipates that he will be far to the west. He hopes that an east wind will carry their fragrance, their most important poetic attribute, along with their color and their reliability for appearing every early spring, and hopes that at least that fragrance will be borne over the airwaves and across the sea to him down in Kyushu. Do not forget that I, your master, have left you there. And don't forget to do that and send me that fragrance when spring comes once again. Today, the Kita no Tenmangu Shrine is a pilgrimage site and often a festival site, as suggested in these images. And it's a place where young men and women from a very early age, children in fact, school children, go and purchase a little talisman on a piece of paper or write their own prayer on a little wood block called an ema and attach it to the trees or the vines or the fences as an offering in hopes that they will succeed in their scholastic endeavors, their forthcoming examinations, their desire to be admitted to the most competitive high schools, colleges, and universities as their lives go on. And also to pray for skill in calligraphy, writing, poetry, composition, and the other arts. Now we're going to move to the story of the Minase Shrine, a less familiar shrine even to Japanese tourists, far less frequently visited, but which has a wonderful set of associations in poetry that is, among other things, about remembrance of the past. The stories primarily begin with the figure of this 9th century poet, also a gentleman who was descended from the imperial family, hence his surname Ariwara no Narihira. We know him as Narihira. He was a historical personage, but we actually don't know a whole lot about him. There's a wonderful literary work available in more than one English translation called The Tales of Ise, Ise Monogatari, often illustrated, the subject of many rich forms of illustration in a whole variety of media. And the illustration shows here a painting showing Narihira in a party of gentlemen. This is presumably Narihira. This is the prince, a prince named Koretaka, whom he was serving. And on one occasion, they traveled to the southwest of the capital on a hunting expedition, presumably hunting for game birds. They spent the whole day out hunting in the fields near what is today the Minase Shrine. It was cherry blossom time. And so when they sat down for a break, that would be not a coffee or tea break, but a sake break to be sure, the prince called upon the gentlemen in the retinue to compose poems to commemorate the occasion and celebrate the occasion. Here we have two more illustrations of the scene, and the one on the right by Tawaraya Sotetsu from the late 17th century has an inscription, as you can see, as if floating across the landscape in an almost graffiti-like manner, which is transcribed for you here. I'll read it in Japanese so you get a sense of what these poems might have sounded like in the Heian period, but in modern 21st century pronunciation. This is one of the few poems that I absolutely know by heart, even though they're very short. I have a short memory, even for short poems, but this is one I can easily rattle off without looking at the screen. Yo no naka ni taete sakura no nakariseba, haru no kokoro wa nodoke karamashi. Japanese poems of this form usually are represented as breaking up into 5 lines of alternating syllable or morai count. I like to call them beats, as in the beats in a measure of a song, alternating numbers of beats in those lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5, 7, 7, totaling 31. No magical significance to the number 31, nor to 5 or 7 that we know of, but it is a very ancient song form in songs that date from before Japanese poetry was written down, beginning in the 8th century, and still today the predominant form of the Japanese poem. The translation shows that the poem sets up a hypothesis which is understood to be contrary to the facts in order to emphasize what's so special about those facts. If there were no such thing as cherry blossoms in this world, then spring hearts might be calm. Cherry blossoms, in addition to their color and scent and the reliability that they will appear every springtime, are also equally reliable in the certainty that they will scatter. They will come and bless us with their pleasures, and then they are no more. Hence the proposition, if there were no such thing as them in the world, then spring hearts might be calm, not anxious about that all too soon to come scattering. One of the things that's interesting about the poem, however, in its original Japanese, the central line, haru no kokoro, that which would or might could be calm, is ambiguous. It could mean hearts in springtime, our humans' hearts. It could also be the heart of spring, a personified springtime that itself is anxious about the all too soon to come departure of the cherry blossoms. So the idea here is that with this witty, if you like, heartfelt, if you like, contrived, if you like, but also I think quite melodious poem, Narihira graced the occasion with the poem he created. Sotatsu, the artist, shows how he graced the occasion and made the moment memorable, as if inscribed forever in memory by inscribing the images of the prince, the poet, and their party, but also the poem itself as a presence in the landscape. He wrote another poem a little later on the expedition, when it had grown quite late and quite a bit of sake had been consumed. And the prince said, you guys can go on drinking and carousing if you want, but I'm going to bed. And he went into what was presumably some kind of temporary hut or dwelling that had been set up for his rest, at which point Narihira, again recognizing his responsibility, among other things, to flatter the prince, his lord, said in a poem, Akanaku ni madaki mo tsuki no kakururu ka, yama no ha nigete idezu mo aranan. Must the moon vanish in such great haste, leaving us still unsatisfied? Retreat, O rim of the hills, and refuse to let it set. Clearly, you can see that the prince has become the moon, the bright moon, a companion to the partiers that is going to take itself away now because it's going to sink beyond the western hills that line the valley in which the capital region sits, and sink as the moon will do as night goes on. So it's the moon that's going to take its charming company away. This poem then becomes what we call an apostrophe, not a punctuation, but a request to unseen forces, unnatural forces, as if it were a kind of, the poem itself were a kind of charm. O rim of the hills, those mountains to the west, retreat, move back so that the moon cannot hide itself. Yama no ha nigete idezu mo aranan. We think of the origins of Japanese poetry as lying in prayers, chants, and magical spells addressed to the unseen forces, the kami, the deity, so that they will take upon themselves actions that are in harmony with the desires of human beings. This poem seems to bring that notion of what Japanese poetry can do again to the forefront in asking the mountain rim to retreat and not let the moon, or perhaps the prince, be hidden from view. Because he composed these memorable poems on this occasion, Narihira is remembered then as someone very cognizant of the responsibilities he has as a court gentleman waiting upon, attending upon the prince Koretaka, to whom he was so close. He was older than the prince, but the prince rather precipitously, not long after that hunting excursion, took vows and became a Buddhist monk and went into reclusion at a monastery to this place called Ono, to the northwest of the city. He was not in the royal succession, this prince. He was not going to succeed to the throne. And most interpreters would say that it was probably because he had so little future in court life, or perhaps because he was otherwise disillusioned with court life, that he took those vows and became a monk. Narihira, having heard about the prince's rather sudden departure and feeling compelled to pay his respects to the prince who had now taken up his life of reclusion, made his way through the wintry snows to visit him there. And another poem that we find in episode 83 of the Tales of Ise is this one. Wasurete wa yume ka tozo omou, omoiki ya yuki fumiwakete kimi o min to wa. If I allow myself to forget, this journey seems to be no more than a dream. Did I ever imagine that I would be making my way through snow like this to see you once again? So this is a poem remembering the former relationships, the good time in the sunshine, out in the warm hunting fields and camped out under the moonlight that only recently had taken place. Never did Narihira imagine, even in a dream, that he would then find himself not long thereafter tramping through the snows to remote Ono to once again make contact with the prince. So these poems of Narihira's make him a touchstone figure in the traditions of Japanese poetry. And the fact that he composed those poems at and around and about the relationship that unfolded and occasioned the trip, the hunting expedition to Minase, is remembered in later poetry. The Emperor Go-Toba, who ruled at the end of the 12th century and very briefly before himself taking vows to yield to a younger member of his family under political pressure to do so, after abdicating, devoted himself exclusively or almost exclusively to poetry. He is the compiler in charge of an early 13th century anthology of Japanese poetry called the Shin Kokin Wakashu, the new collection of old and new Japanese poems. And its spring section includes this poem by Gotoba himself. He maintained a villa at Minase because it was a site that he could visit to celebrate the traditions of poetry, in which figures like Narihira were so prominent. This poem reads, Miwa taseba Yamamoto Kasumu. I'm sorry, there's a typographical error there. Kasumu, K-A-S-U-M-U. Yamamoto Kasumu, Minase gawa, Yube wa akito, nani omoiken. Looking far, I see the haze move low on the slopes along Minase River, and wonder how I ever thought autumn the season for dusk. Well, Gotoba is not only remembering Narihira's poem and the visit to Minase made by him and his prince and their friends. He's also remembering and addressing and taking issue with this, a great classical work of literature from the early 11th century, perhaps the late 10th century, Sei Shonagon's Pillow Book. It opens with this famous essay about the seasons, which I've quoted here from Meredith McKinney's translation, only in part, where she lists the 4 seasons and then extrapolates from her own sensibilities the qualities and times of day that for her characterize, perhaps poetically, as well as visually and sensorially, those times of day. She says, in spring, it's the dawn, when the slowly paling mountain is tinged with red and wisps of faintly crimson purple cloud float in the sky. You'll note the period there. Indeed, the sentence, as we see it in the Japanese, has no predicate. She doesn't go on to say, that's what's special, memorable, most charming, most beautiful. She just leaves it at this. Of autumn, she says, it's the evening. The blazing sun has sunk very close to the mountain rim, and now even the crows in 3s and 4s or 2s and 3s hurry to their nest, etc. And oh, when the sun has sunk, to hear in the growing darkness the wind and the song of autumn insects. So you can see that Gotoba is not only channeling Narihira's poem, he's also contesting, in a sense, Sei Shonagon's declaration, because he says, how could I have ever thought, as she told me, that autumn was the season for dusk? Look at how Minase Gawa looks as spring haze moves down the slopes at this early hour of the day. From Kyoto, we now move to Shikoku. It's a place of wonders, such as the vast garden park called Ritsurin in Takumatsu, built at the foot of the castle. It is a former castle town from the Edo period, a huge strolling garden. It's a place where we will also be seeing traditional farm and rural dwellings that have been laboriously preserved, and rustic bridges across the rivers, and where we can luxuriate in hot water spas. But we'll also be going to Naoshima the Art Island for viewings of extraordinary art installations and lavish hotels designed by Ando. From there, then we'll be crossing the inland sea, Seto Naikai, to Kurashiki. In 1972 spring, I decided that having spent a few months starting to learn Japanese at Yale, that if I was going to get anywhere with it, I'd better go to Japan. And I'd heard that there was something that some of you in our audience today may have heard of at that time, called the 5-year BA program. Kingman Brewster obtained a grant from the Carnegie Foundation to promote the idea that you should pardon the expression, young men at Yale, when the program started, I'm in only the second class, 1974, that admitted women as Yale undergraduates, that young men, rather than making a beeline to white shoe law firms and investment banks in Manhattan, should spend some time in other parts of the world, working, making a living for themselves, preferably in developing economies. I learned that 2 men in classes ahead of me had gone to the city called Kurashiki in Okayama Prefecture in Western Japan, lying on the shores of the inland sea, opposite Shikoku. So I decided to go there, and I got myself a job at the same English teaching institute that they had worked at. Well, Kurashiki had been a major shipbuilding area in the and steel production in the area called Mizushima, right on the shore of the inland sea. And so here we come face to face with what it looks like today, still an extraordinarily, but let's face it, not very pretty, industrial complex. This is part of what I confronted when I went there to teach English to civil engineers in those factories. But I also got to explore the beautiful willow-lined canal streets of this beautiful city, Kurashiki. Its name means the place where kura, storehouses, which is the type of architecture you see represented in the photographs on the right, where they spread out along the river. In the Edo period in the 17th and 18th century, Kurashiki was an important port city where grain, both not only rice, but wheat and other grains that had been cultivated upland, upriver, in the upper reaches of Okayama were brought downstream and then shipped from here eastward and westward to larger metropolitan areas. The Ohara family developed their wealth in the textile business. But here, just a momentary detour into yet deeper history. The gentleman that I went to work with there in Kurashiki is the gentleman at the center of this picture, Mr. Nagase Takashi, now deceased. In 1975, he had spent, by that time, many years compensating, literally compensating, with religious and humanitarian motivation for what he had done as an interpreter, an army interpreter at the prison camp in Thailand that you all know as the site of the story of the famed movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai. He was actually a translator there, and he had made efforts to contact the British officers and other veterans with whom he had interacted there. And he finally arranged in 1975 for those survivors, led by the gentleman on the left, Eric Lomax, to meet in the middle of the bridge. In 1975, the reconstructed bridge. You remember that it got blown up in the movie. In 1970, spring of 75, I was working for a Japanese public relations firm here in Los Angeles. I picked up the Los Angeles Times, and the cover story showed Mr. Nagase, my former employer, from just a few years prior, and these survivor British officers meeting on the bridge on that memorable occasion. Just one of the many things that this gentleman did to close a chapter and, let us say, open a new one in the remembrance of Japan's past. This was the karashiki I experienced for that wonderful, quite sybaritic year away from Yale. And it still looks like this today and is well worth a stopover that many tourists do make, but I would say not enough. It's highly romanticized as a destination for Japanese tourists because you can see that is a place that you can walk along these willow-lined canals and feel as if you are making a journey into the Japanese past of the 17th and 18th century. Indeed, that's why it has so often served as a film location site. The Ohara Museum, created by the Ohara family, is most famous for its Western art collections. You can see Cézanne there, you can see Gauguin there, you can see at the far right an El Greco, and indeed one of the best coffee houses among the buildings lining the canal is a wonderful coffee shop famous all over Japan called El Greco. If you choose, however, you might want to focus more on their extraordinary collection of the woodcuts by the famous woodcut artist Munakata Shiko from the 20th century. Or you might choose to visit the Kurashiki Museum of Folk Craft, which was one of the first museums in Japan to celebrate traditional folk arts, ceramics, wood making, basket making, textile weaving, and dyeing. And indeed, I had the good fortune of studying with a young woman in my year in Kurashiki, studying with a young woman who had been trained in weaving and dyeing at the Museum of Folk Craft, where, and I did some weaving under her tutelage, and there, where she had in turn come in contact with the artists still continuing the legacy in the traditions of folk craft, for which the ceramicist Hamada Shoji and his British friend, companion, and co-conspirator in the promotion of the traditional Japanese ceramic arts, Bernard Leach. Collections of both their works are to be found in both these museums in Kurashiki. But from there, we will, later in that same day, we'll hop on the bullet train. Again, as I said, as we travel eastward to the eastern capital, Tokyo, we'll be lucky if we catch a glimpse of Mount Fuji like that. But it is there. And then we'll find ourselves amidst the wonders of Tokyo, which feature, of course, the new imperial palace at the very center of the city, a converted shogunal castle made into the imperial palace, traditional architecture of the Edo period, the Eiffel Tower-like Tokyo Tower. We'll visit a traditional shrine, the Kannon Shrine in the northern part of the city, most beautiful in the evening hours. And we'll probably at some point drive by the National Diet Building, which fortunately Godzilla did not entirely consume. If you have any questions about this presentation, I will now end my slide share, and I believe that Lauren will be taking over the forum.
Thank you for that, Professor Kamens. Well, now I feel like I can't wait until 2023 to go to Japan. You've made it so interesting, and I love the way that you incorporated the literary history so that we can better understand the culture and not just the place.
That was my idea. I'm glad that came through.
It came through for sure. There's actually a question that I received via email from James before the presentation started. James says, how would you characterize the role of religion in Japan today, and how influential is Christianity? Just two very small questions there.
Right. Well, as you know, former Prime Minister Abe was just assassinated by a clearly mentally distraught person who somehow blames him for his mother's bankruptcy due to her contributions to the Universalist Church. What that tells you is that there are many, many religious movements in Japan. We call the indigenous or traditional Japanese originating religion Shinto, the way of the kami, the way of the gods, although even that term for it is a relatively late appellation, invention, when it became clear to the Japanese that there was more than one kind of religion, and so we better have a name for that one. Buddhism was introduced to Japan perhaps as early as the 5th century, but really comes to the fore in the 8th century, when it was adopted by the imperial family as an official religion alongside that of what we now call Shinto. If you ask if there is such a thing as the average man and woman on the street in Japan about what is your religion, they will likely to say, I don't have a religion. I don't believe in any religion. Or they will say, well, I was married in a church, a Christian church ceremony, but I also had a Shinto traditional ceremony. But all of my family, their remains, their ashes are buried in a Buddhist cemetery. And I expect that I will have a Buddhist funeral when I die. So religion in Japan is an extraordinarily eclectic mix. Even in terms of the experience of most contemporary Japanese in their lives experience some manifestation of all these religions. There are a number of also so-called new religions created in the 19th and 20th century as various kinds of movements, which some people would call cults, but of course you would offend the adherents of those religions if you refer to them that way. And many people who are adherents of those religions might also, in addition, anticipate that their remains would be placed in a Buddhist altar or a Buddhist cemetery. It's really a mix.
I was speaking, but I was muted. I think it's difficult for us in the U.S. to have a perspective of the ways in which Buddhism, for example, and Shintoism can sit alongside each other and not necessarily be in conflict or competition. Right. And there's a religious aspect, but there's also a cultural aspect that just sort of goes along with the landscape.
Right. And in some cases, we can see this manifested in physical buildings themselves. So obviously, because Shinto, what we call the worship of the kami, predates the introduction of Buddhism, there were many what we now call Shinto shrines, such as the imperial shrine at Ise or at Izumo, which are very, very ancient, predating recorded Japanese history. Eventually, with the introduction of Buddhism, it became very common, even in the most revered kami worship institutions, to have a Buddhist monastery or convent, or both, built alongside of and within the precincts of those shrines, and vice versa. So until relatively recent times, we would want to think of most Japanese religious sites as complexes, like a multiplex movie theater with at least 2 buildings, if not more, or 2 groups of buildings dedicated to both sets of deities. It became further the idea, widespread from, let us say from the 10th century until the 19th, that the Japanese deities are Buddhist deities, and vice versa. The sun goddess, from whom the imperial family claims descent, was identified with the Buddha of the sun, the Dainichi Buddha. And all the Buddhist canon was identified as a manifestation of one or another of the Japanese deities, and vice versa. When the imperial institution was restored after several centuries of rule by the shoguns, one of the things that happened was a reaction against Buddhism. And these multiplexes were disassembled. In many cases, that meant that either at a Buddhist institution, the Shinto shrine was destroyed, or much more frequently, the monastery adjacent to an important kami shrine was destroyed. Well, one of the things that happened at that point, in particular, was that the images of Buddhas, and in some cases of kami, worshipped in those buildings became homeless. And what happened to them? They went into museums, and vast numbers of them were shipped overseas. So if you go to the Guimet Museum in Paris, or you go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, or the Seattle Asian Art Museum, you will see huge numbers of Buddhist images, icons, that left Japan at that time, went on the art market, and would likely not have even have been preserved had they not gone abroad. That's an interesting and important aspect of the history that we were just talking about in terms of religious art.
It reminds me a lot of the ways that Christianity and Islam encounter each other in
Yes,
the East.
that's right.
And
Yes, I'm going to Jerusalem for the first time in my life next week, and I expect to see that come to life.
yeah, I think we can relate to it more if we think about it through that lens,
Yeah.
as Westerners.
Yes.
It's something a little bit more familiar to us. And even the way that Catholicism encountered
Yes.
pagan rituals
Yes.
of worship in, for example, the British Isles or in Europe,
Yes.
it becomes a little bit more familiar when we think about it that way. So thank you for that explanation. I also want to note that you did a wonderful presentation for us in 2020 as part of our festival called Cycles of Ritual and Renewal, Summer Festivals in Japan. And we got to dive more into many of these shrines
Yes.
and
Yes.
the religious rituals and the history behind them. So for those who are interested in better understanding religion in Japan, that presentation is on our website, available for viewing on demand. And it coincides with a virtual tour that's on our website, which is another great way of learning about travel to Japan. And that virtual tour is just a really dense survey of destinations in Japan and art, culture, festivals, food, many of the things that you touched on lightly, we get to go into more detail. So I invite everybody to take a look at both the virtual tour and your 2020 presentation, and I will link them in the chat. There were, if we have just a few more minutes, there were a couple of other questions.
Question in the Q&A.
There's a question in the Q&A. There's also a question in the chat that I bet people are interested in. Let's see. Julie asks if Abe's murder will be felt as one travels through Japan, even though much of what we would experience on this trip would be cultural.
I think I don't think it will be felt in any particular way, but one might find oneself in conversation with our Japanese guides, for example, who might be able to help us see that event through their eyes. What was astonishing, as you may have read in the press about that terrible event, is that guns are utterly unfamiliar to Japanese by and large. Law officers do not carry guns. It is very, very difficult to purchase a weapon of that kind. The assassin, as you may know, used a handmade gun. I'm sure any of us could go online and find out how to make a gun if we really set our minds to it without going too far underground. So what's really shocking apparently was that very fact that it was an assassination by gunfire, and also a kind of disillusionment that the relatively low security provided on a campaign speaking tour for a still very prominent but politician who's no longer in office would not have prevented this. But that kind of disillusionment in Japan is something that has been a presence, particularly since the 2011 earthquake and the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which really is seen as a touchstone event in sort of taking the blinders off millions of people's eyes about the efficiency, wisdom, care taken by governments to protect the population. But these events, like horrific events in the United States, I don't mean to sound cynical or dismissive, but we had a cluster of horrific, absolutely horrific school shootings. They raise our consciousness to a point of beyond pain and shock. And life goes on, and politics goes on, and not a lot happens. and not a lot changes. And the same is true in Japan. In our Q&A, Jan Thurman says, I was in Kurashiki in 2017. Since then, a serious flood has occurred with major damage to the town. Has that damage now been repaired? I'm quite sure that it has, Jan, but I have not been there myself for over a decade. So we'll have to see. But it's a very prosperous part of Japan, even today. And I would be very surprised if we would see any evidence of the damage from those floods. Whereas if we were to go to Fukushima and say the area around the city of Sendai, as we did in 2019, we would still see vast areas where the devastation from the tsunami has not yet been erased from visual memory.
Thank you for that. I want to go, we have a few really good questions coming in. I want to go to, I believe it's Danielle's question. The pillow book is also important for an outstanding understanding of Yasujiro Ozu's films, such as Early Spring, End of Summer, Autumn Afternoon, and Late Autumn. Will the trip include a discussion of these or other films?
Oh, that sounds like a great thing to discuss. I'm not myself a film scholar, but we could, I could certainly see how we might create a group, right? Even a face group or FaceTime group or Instagram group or something.
Well, we could talk about it on Zoom in our
right, where we all might watch those films in advance and have some ongoing discussion about them on the bus, in the bars, in the hot spring bath as we go along. I was interested in where that question was going. There is, as many may know, there is a film called The Pillow Book, which is only very, very loosely related to The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. It would be fascinating to think about it with respect to the wonderful films of Ozu. That's a great idea. We can add some film watching along to some of the readings that I'll recommend prior to the trip.
Well, we have a couple of people who asked about what would a good place to start, what would be a good place to start if you were new to Japanese literature and you wanted to get at least a footing in it?
Yes.
Louise asked that question.
Well, I would strongly recommend The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. It's a good book to have as a kind of bedside table and read a few entries as you're falling to sleep. It is a miscellany by a woman who was serving at court at the end of the 10th century in the retinue of an imperial consort. It is her highly sensorial and subjective view of the cultural and society of court life, with many musings on aesthetic experience, aesthetic value, behavior, how a gentleman should behave when wooing a lady, and how a lady should behave when being wooed, and much more. It is perhaps the most vibrant kind of insight into classical Japanese culture. I would, among Japanese novels, I'll just name one. My very favorite, which I recommend particularly for travelers who are going to be spending time in the Kansai area. It's a novel called The Makioka Sisters, Makioka, The Makioka Sisters by Tanizaki, Tanizaki. Will you put that in the chat, please, Lauren? Translated by Edward Seidensticker, a novel from the 1950s. It is about a family of a merchant family from Osaka who are weathering the cultural and political and social changes of the 1930s, leading up to the outbreak of the Second Great War. And it focuses on a trio of sisters, their marriage dilemmas and adventures and family tensions. It includes outings that they make from their home in Kobe to Kyoto at cherry blossom time. And it includes many, it has many subtle and some not so subtle connections to the other great work of Japanese fiction from the classical period, The Tale of Genji, which Tanizaki, the author of the Makioka Sisters, also spent time with while he was writing that novel, The Makioka Sisters. He also was engaged in translating The Tale of Genji from its classical forms into modern Japanese. He was not the first nor the only person who did this, and he actually made 3 different revisions of his translation. So he was deeply embedded in that great classical literary work, and it echoes and repercussions of it surface in the Makioka Sisters. So I would recommend reading the Makioka Sisters and then take up The Tale of Genji, but that's a big undertaking. Also a book to be savored and not necessarily one to take along on a long trip. It's much too heavy to carry in your luggage, even in paperback.
I'm looking at the paperback edition so I can post them here.
I recommend the translation by Dennis Washburn.
What's the last name?
Washburn.
Washburn.
Washburn. Dennis Washburn.
Okay, we'll put the link up for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those. We're getting lots of thanks, words of thanks for
and
that.
I will assemble, right, Lauren, we'll assemble and share a reading list that we can add to as we go along, but starting sometime early fall.
Yes.
Is our plan.
That's right, yes. There were a couple of additional questions. Lyndon says, my greatest takeaway from Kyoto was the existence, almost non-existent, of Christian worship on the very verge of the city, and the cemeteries in the hills above, deliberately left untended and almost purposefully abandoned. The graves were almost Western and individual in size, yet ironically offering some of the best views overlooking the traditional burial grounds of vast numbers of ashes and tiny urns and tiny open tombs in which they sit by tens of thousands. It's a little bit like a poem that Lyndon has written here in the chat.
Yes.
I wants to know your thoughts on that. Christian cemeteries on the outskirts of Kyoto.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with them. And I don't know their age. I would wonder if they are still in use, where new graves are being added there. I would imagine not. It's very interesting to think about the preservation of cemeteries. My thoughts run to, New England cemeteries, which in some cases are so carefully preserved, though no longer in use. In the sense that their new graves are not being added. I have visited the destroyed Jewish cemeteries of Berlin, where no tombstones remain. And all we know is that there were tombs there. And I have visited a Jewish cemetery in the town of Tarnow, Poland, where my own grandmother was born and from which she emigrated to the United States. And only a tiny section of it was maintained. But there, to my surprise, the vast acres of tombs and tombstones remained undisturbed, but completely overgrown with weeds and huge trees and moss, so that one could not really make one's way into the cemetery. I would really need to know much more about the history and origin of the particular cemetery that Lyndon is talking about, to know if perhaps it could well be, for example, that the church or missionary organization that had established that part of that cemetery for its parishioners no longer operates in Japan, and so that there is no one to take responsibility for it. That would be a guess.
That's an interesting way to look at touring the cities, as you sort of described about your own history, looking at the history of the cemeteries there. I want to go to a question shared by Charles, who I mentioned in your introduction that you were working on a calligraphy album from the 17th century that's at the Beinecke Library, and yes. Charles wanted to know more about that project.
Okay, I'll put something in the chat about it, if I could. Let's see. Yes. Okay, here we go. Please Google or otherwise search the Tekagami Project. That is the project website where we are creating a digital analog to this physical calligraphy album compiled in the late 17th century. One of only a handful of these extraordinary albums of its kind that are in collections outside of Japan. There is one at the Metropolitan Museum called the Mokagami. There is one at the University of Oregon. And there is one extraordinary one that we're working on at the Beinecke. It was acquired for Yale in the 1930s, in yet another period when works of Japanese art and culture were available on the market in large numbers. In the 17th century, there arose a great interest in collecting and assembling samples of the calligraphy of famous people of the past. Yet another, we might think of them as yet another vehicle or space where one can revisit the past in the form of ink traces on paper. And in many cases, they were assembled as luxury elements of a bride's trousseau. Some people think that they served them the purpose of being models for that bride's own handwriting practice. But rather, they seem also to be visible histories of Japanese calligraphy. How has writing been done over time by members of the imperial family, by members of the royal court, by distinguished scholars and poets and calligraphers themselves and other notables. Content matters little. Form and style of the writing itself matters a great deal. So many of the samples are fragmentary. If you think of the sample as perhaps being a paragraph lifted from some text, whether it be a Buddhist sutra or a letter or a diary, the quotation, the citation in this sample may begin in the middle of a sentence and end in the middle of another sentence, because literally these samples have been cut out of other manuscripts. To us, that seems like kind of a desecration of their integrity, but there's a purpose here which has to do with the zeal of collectors to possess these samples in their own right as vestiges of those acts of writing by those individuals of the past. I find them tremendously interesting. I have a forthcoming article about whether we can think about them or not as texts, which I won't try to share in the chat right now because it's not available, but when it is, I will share it with you, Lauren, so you can share it with our constituents.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this. We have, I think, one more question, if we can squeeze it in, is you talk about this manuscript that you're working on, and you talked sort of in the beginning about some of the literary traditions, and interestingly, I noted that they tied in with sort of municipalities and governments commissioning poetry, etc. And so the question is, how much support now do the arts receive from the Japanese government? Mm-hmm. And is there funding for artists and writers and poets, or do they rely more now on private organizations?
I think it's both, the same as it is in this country, particularly for the Japanese art, traditional arts. The royal court at New Year's holds a poetry party to open the year. And that is one instance in which the emperor's court, even today, demonstrates its continued commitment to the most traditional literary forms. My impression is that compared to the United States, I think there's much more corporate and private support for arts organizations and institutions and individual art endeavors than there is, say, to the United States with our National Endowment for the Arts and state arts councils. Every town and every prefecture would certainly have its culture agency, which promotes largely traditional and some more innovative contemporary arts and exhibitions, but much more of that funding, again, I think compared to what goes on in the United States, comes from corporate sources. Every major department store in Tokyo and other major cities has exhibition space, and they show often blockbuster exhibitions of Western artists, contemporary Japanese artists and calligraphers, you name it. And that's something that you're not likely to see at Macy's, not to mention Target.
Certainly not. Well, all great reasons to think about visiting Japan and joining this trip in April of 2023. We can repost the link to register on the trip for those who are interested. We certainly invite you to check it out. We also will post this presentation on the Yale Alumni Academy website so that you can come back and watch it later if you would like to see it again. And thank you, Professor Kamens, for joining us.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was a great privilege to see so many familiars and so many new friends.
Well, and I hope all of you will join us for the next Alumni Academy Festival event, which is taking place tomorrow at 4 o'clock. I will see some of you again tomorrow, and I'll see you, Professor Kamens,
Okay.
on Zoom and the next time.
Yes,
Thank you.
indeed. Okay. Bye
Okay,
for now.
bye. Bye.